The world was, of course, aghast over the brutal rape and killing of a young student in India. And yet, in the West, the word rape is increasingly bandied about casually, and its horrors questioned by prominent American politicians. Joining us now to help us understand how this has happened, in Boston, Massachusetts, Jaclyn Friedman. She's editor of Yes Means Yes, Visions of Female Sexual Power and a World Without Rape. And Jaclyn, it's good of you to join us on TVO tonight. Thanks very much.
Happy to be here.
I hesitate to do this again, but I want to get an understanding of where we're coming from here. I want to know what your reaction was when you first heard the news of this appalling incident that happened over in India.
Oh, I mean, like everyone, I was disgusted. I would like to say that I was shocked. I think mostly I'm shocked at the marvelous protests that have grown out of it. I'm not shocked that there was a brutal rape in India or practically anywhere else, but what we do know is that most of those rapes are going unreported. So the fact that this one has gained so much attention, I think, is great. It's galvanizing a conversation, and in India, it's galvanizing a lot of really necessary and overdue outrage. So that part I find encouraging.
Many people, rightly or wrongly, may have taken some comfort in the fact that this happened on the other side of the world in a developing country, and therefore they feel it couldn't happen here like that, so we're a little, not smug, but we're allowed to feel a little better than that. Do you think that's an appropriate response?
No, I think it's really counterproductive on a number of levels. First of all, it's really othering it, right? It makes the folks in India look backward. It also imagines that there's one culture in India, that the culture in Delhi is the same culture as the culture in a small village town or in Bombay or wherever else, right? So we have to not imagine that India itself is a monolith. And then we also have to take a look at our own business, right? So every culture is different. I'm not saying that the culture in Delhi, we have the exact same problems around gender and sexual violence as we do here, but they sure have a lot in common. We have an epidemic of sexual violence right here in North America, and it has to do with impunity, it has to do with us constantly blaming the victim, and it has to do with us, not taking the crime seriously here in the US and in Canada. So there's a lot in common, and we certainly don't have anything to be proud of.
Okay, to that end, I want to follow up by asking, well, first let me read something here. We've got a columnist for Canada's national newspaper, the Globe and Mail, named Doug Saunders, and he wrote a piece a few days ago, and I want to read you, you'll forgive me, a bit of a longish excerpt from this, and then I'll get you to comment on it. Here's what he wrote. Indians have begun to recognize this epidemic of sexual hatred in their midst. Far from just a matter of rape, it's an environment where in some regions there are 800 girls alive for every 1,000 boys because sex-selective abortion and female infanticide are so widespread. Where the physical abuse of women is seen as mundane. Where even major sex crimes are usually described in major newspapers as Eve-teasing. India finally awoke this week to its national shame. But then, an odd thing happened in Canada and other Western countries. A number of prominent people, notably anti-rape activists and feminists, rushed to declare that India's crisis wasn't notably severe. Quote, rape and sexual violence against women are endemic everywhere, argued writer Owen Jones, denouncing those who describe India's situation as a national crisis since it's just part of a global pandemic of violence against women. And back to Saunders now. Yet it's not all the same, not even close. To use the situation in New Delhi as a way to draw attention to sex crimes in Canada is akin to using the Rwandan genocide to make points about gang crime in Scarborough. Rape is a terrible crime everywhere, and it probably remains under-prosecuted and all too commonplace and hidden in many places in the West, so there's plenty of room for activism. But in part, because that activism has succeeded, rape is a grotesque anomaly, universally recognized as a serious crime. That's not true at all in many parts of India. To Doug's point, have we not made some headway on this issue in the West that at least he is suggesting we ought to acknowledge at some level?
We have made some headway on this issue in the West, but very little. If you take a look at rates of rape over the last 20 years in the US, and if you look at studies that compare apples to apples, so you have to look at the studies' methodologies and how they ask their questions, what they're measuring, we see really no movement in rates of rape in the last 20 years. I have so many things to say about this piece. I did read it previously. One is that I've seen no one say that rape is not serious and severe in India, right? That it's not a severe situation there. Saying that it's also a problem here does not mean to say that it's not severe there. And of course there are going to be cultural differences. But we know that about 1 in 5 women in North America in her life is going to be the victim of sexual assault, right? What does that tell you? That is, in fact, an epidemic. If 1 in 5 women in North America was being carjacked or kidnapped or even getting the flu, we would say, hey, that's an epidemic. Why aren't we doing more about it? And then as to his argument that it's rape in the West is universally seen as something horrible and is held to account, well, I mean, I wish that were true. I would love to live in that world. We see cases all the time. Right here in the US, in Steubenville, Ohio, there's an ongoing case where this girl was drugged and carried from party to party while being raped and violated in ways that I don't want to describe on air by members of the vaunted football team, right? And there's been a huge cover-up in the town because they don't want to disrupt this football team. The same is true in Notre Dame, the US school that just played in the big college championship last night. They have several students who on the football team who are raping with impunity because they're football stars. We have cases in Winnipeg in 2011, a judge in a case where the jury found that a rape occurred refused to give the rapist a sentence because the woman was wearing sexy clothes and had flirted with him. So, and you know, I could go on. I could take up all of your airtime with examples of rape not being taken seriously right here on our own soil. So I wish that were true. I wish he had also done his research before he made that assertion.
Well, and we haven't mentioned as well the 2 Republican candidates who ran in the last election just a few weeks ago and had some pretty stupid things to say about rape. And both of those candidates lost, incidentally, which I presume gave you some comfort anyway. But let me just go back to something that you said in the middle of that last answer. We were talking about rape, and then you said 1 in 5 women are sexually assaulted. And we should not, I presume I'm on solid ground here when I say we shouldn't conflate the two. They're not the same thing. Is that right?
You know, it's difficult. Some studies separate them out. Some of them keep them together. So that's why we have approximate numbers. Sexual assault includes violations that aren't defined legally as rape. Rape almost always includes penetration of some kind. And even the definitions of rape vary from sort of jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But sexual assault doesn't mean somebody whistled at you on the street. It's a serious bodily sexual violation, and it's on a continuum of sexual violence against women. I don't think that those two phenomena are separate. It's a question of degree and the actual action that was taken.
Okay, you'll forgive me. I don't know the study you're referring to when you say 1 in 5 women in North America are sexually assaulted. How do we know that?
We know that from social science research. We certainly don't know that from reporting because we know that this is a US number, about 54% of rapes go unreported here in the US, right? So we know that from researchers talking to women, talking to men also, because men also can be victims of sexual violence. It's slightly different than the topic we're talking about tonight, but I want to include that. And asking about their history with sexual violence and getting reports directly from people. So surveys that are scientifically constructed.
Okay. I want to get some insight from you now on why the word rape has moved into our modern vocabulary in a particularly cavalier fashion. And by that I mean you can hang around with a group of guys in a bar, for example, and you can see a tackle made, and you can hear one person say to the other, boy, he really raped him on that play. Or even more ludicrously, I've heard the word rape used in reference to devouring a hamburger particularly aggressively, where somebody will say, boy, you know, he really raped that hamburger. How is this happening now?
Well, I mean, I think it's a perfect example of how unseriously we take sexual violence. There are some people who argue that rape should never be used metaphorically. I'm not one of them. I think if you want to talk about the rape of the environment, right, which is a very serious and important issue, you know, there's an argument to be made for that usage, but using it in this sort of casual way, and almost always it's sort of like, yeah, go you, high five, right? You've exerted some violent dominance over something, and that's good, right? So it's not just that it's been taken lightly, it's that it's being taken as a badge of honor of some kind. And that plays in exactly to the way that rapists continue to rape with impunity here in the West and elsewhere. Why is it happening now? I don't know. I wish I could answer that question, but I do see the same phenomenon happening. And what it does is it encourages several things, right? So it encourages rapists to keep on raping. We know that about approximately 1 in 20 guys is a rapist. So most of the raping is done by a small percentage of guys. Most men are not rapists, and I want to be super clear about that. But that small percent, say 6%, depends on which study you look at, they're in your friend group, they're in your casual group, they're on Facebook, right? And when they hear those jokes, we know that they think all men are rapists, right? The rapists think everyone does it. And when you normalize it like that, you're giving them permission. And then again, when we take it not seriously, what we see that when women report sexual violence to authorities, people who might help them, they're not taken seriously. Even if they are taken seriously, prosecutions don't move forward. When prosecutions move forward, there aren't convictions. The rates of prosecution and conviction of sexual violence, both in Canada and the US, are far lower than any other violent crime. And part of that is because of this culture where we just don't take it seriously.
I must say, I find it particularly perplexing that this word rape has gone so casually into our vocabulary now. And I shouldn't say our vocabulary. Where I tend to hear it is among teenagers or those in their early 20s. And those would be children, if I can put it that way, who were raised by women who of course, were doing their mothering during a time where gender equality was really on the front burner of much of society. And I wonder where they got the idea that it was somehow okay, having presumably grown up in homes with strong mothers, where it was okay to use that word that way. Where does that come from?
Well, I think we don't want to overestimate the amount of gender equality in our society. So here in the US, we have a record-breaking number of senators that are women and, entering the new Congress. We have 20 out of 100, right? That's our big step forward, 20%. We know that women, and forgive me, I live in the US, I have US statistics. Women in the US make about 77 cents on the male dollar. Reports of gender equality are rather over-exaggerated. So I think that they get it from the culture at large, which really still does not value women as equal human beings who have bodily autonomy.
Well, let me, just so I'm absolutely clear on what you're saying here, do you believe in North America, I appreciate you're in the States and I'm in Canada, but let's say for North America, do you think we live in a culture of rape?
Yes. Yeah, when I say that, I mean we live in a culture that condones, that looks the other way, that allows rape to flourish. Most of us are not rapists. Most of us will never rape, whatever our gender, right? But most of us participate in a culture that allows it to keep happening. A system of devaluing women, treating women's bodies as though they're men's property, a whole culture around women and women's sexuality and women's bodies. And also boys will be boys, sort of like, oh, well, what are you going to do kind of attitude toward it that refuses to hold rapists to account. There's just such cultural impunity for rapists. And so they keep on doing it.
In which case, in our last couple of minutes, give us some recommendations. What would you like to see happen to reduce that culture of rape on this continent?
Absolutely. So we have to start by ending impunity. We have to start by training law enforcement, training our court systems to take rape seriously so that we see at the very least, prosecution rates and conviction rates that are in line with other violent crimes, right? That's measurable. We have to figure out what improvements need to be made and make them. We also have to end impunity for our politicians who don't take this seriously. So I don't know if it's making the papers up in Canada, but here in the US, the Violence Against Women Act, which has been in force since 1994, our Congress just refused to renew it because it had protections for Native American women if they were raped by non-Native folks on the reservation. It's shocking to me that would be controversial, that we wouldn't want to give them protections, but that was seen as not okay. So we have to hold those politicians to account too. We also have to think about, what do we do once we hold rapists accountable? How do we heal them? How do we, convince them and rehabilitate them so they don't rape? And then finally, all of this is going to require a cultural change. We have to stop seeing women's bodies as men's property or as the property of the culture to amuse, right? We have to stop seeing rape as inevitable. We have to say, this is an epidemic. Women have just as much right as men do to do anything, to walk around alone at night, wearing whatever, talking to whomever, drinking, without fearing that our bodies are going to be violated. And until women have that same experience of men walking around the world feeling safe and feeling like we have the right to our bodies and our lives, we have a problem on our hands. We have to shift the culture off of blaming victims and onto holding perpetrators to account. We have to take the blinders off.
Jaclyn Friedman, it's awfully good of you to join us on TVO tonight. You've given us a lot to think about. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.